Uh, Dave, welcome everyone. This is our 159th Reading Online Sports Economics Seminar. It's a great pleasure to have Dave Berri presenting. It's not his first time, and thankfully we've conspired to have a time that works better for him, given that here in the UK we haven't yet moved on to summertime, whereas you guys have in North America. So Dave's not up quite so early today for this, but thank you, Dave, from Southern Utah University. He's going to present No One Gets Paid What They're Worth, exploring player value in the early history of professional football. I want to quickly say that in the information I sent, I said that there's a deadline today for the Ibero-American Conference on Sports Economics. That actually isn't until April. I'm not sure what date it is in April yet, but I will provide some updated information in due course. But do look out for the Ibero American Conference on Sports Economics in Madrid's submission deadline in early April. Dave, please take away your talk.
All right. Well, thanks for having me. I'm sure you're thinking of football. It's basketball. We're going to do basketball. It's professional basketball. So we're talking about the player value in professional basketball. I think I can. Let's see if we can share the screen. I think that actually will work. We hope, maybe. Let's see here. Share content. Oh, wait a minute. Let's try it this way. Let's go like that. Maybe that'll work. Let me try this again. There it is. Can you see that?
Yep, we got it.
All right, perfect. Okay, that's on my other monitor. Okay, let me try to put it that way. All right. Okay, so all right, yeah. So this is No One Gets Paid What They Are Worth. We're going to look at player value in the early history of professional basketball. I want to start off by telling the backstory of the research, because to me that's kind of the interesting part of the whole thing. So I'm going to start off with about this particular book. Whoops. Okay. So this is a book. It's called Blackball by Teresa. I think it's Runstedler. So it's a story about African American players, professional basketball in the 1960s, 1970s. And as I wrote on the slide, once upon a time I read a book. That's actually a joke my wife often tells. I have my Neff Walker and I we're going to be publishing another book, a book in April on women in sports called Slaying the Trolls. That's the 6th book that I will publish. And so the joke that my wife often tells, because she reads far more than I do, and she's read many more books than I've read, is that I've actually written more books than I've actually read. That's not entirely true, but it's not. That's not totally, well, that's not entirely true. But this book I read this book. And as I was reading this book, and I believe this was last summer, she's talking in this book about a Senate hearing in 1971. This is Antitrust and Monopoly Committee of the Senate in the U.S. And the purpose of the meeting was to determine should the NBA and the ABA be made exempt from the Sherman Antitrust Act and be allowed to merge. The ABA, when it was created in 1967, it's pretty clear, and we'll touch upon this later, that the intent of those who created that league were to actually join with the NBA. Unfortunately, the law was that's kind of illegal, that you can do that, or at least it could be illegal. So they were having a hearing to see if that was true or not. In the course of that hearing, a senator from Nebraska asked Oscar Robertson, who was the head of the players in the NBA, and the players in the NBA were opposed to this merger. He says to Oscar Robertson, "You seem to have done pretty well. Do you really think that you are worth more than the $100,000 that you are getting?" And Oscar Robertson, and in the book, she describes that it was not an immediate reply. Oscar Robertson paused for a bit before he says this. But his reply was, to be honest, I think I am worth more than 100,000. Once upon a time, I actually looked at that. I wrote a paper about 3 years ago for the Antitrust Bulletin, looking at what is the economic value of Oscar Robertson. And really, that paper was quite a bit focused on Oscar Robertson. And if you look at 1971, he's worth, according to what I did back then, about $300,000. So he actually was worth, by my estimation, more than the $100,000 he was paid. So that's kind of sort of some background. I want to tell you sort of how this specific paper comes about. In the book, she notes, on the third and final day of the testimony, two economists decide to challenge the NBA's claim of impending financial disaster, because the NBA was claiming, as the NBA has always claimed, and they still make similar claims today, that they are on the brink of financial ruin and there's no way to make money at professional basketball. Roger Noll was one of those economists. Roger Noll is, if you are in sports economics and you've been doing this for a long time, as I have, as many of you have done, is a name that you should be familiar with. Roger Noll is one of the very first writers in this space. If you think back to one of the most common forms of competitive balance historically was the measure that Roger Noll and Gerald Scully independently came up with. So Roger Noll is this big name in this space. And when I saw that name, I was that piqued my interest. And then as I read through the book, it becomes clear that Noll had financial data. He actually had the financial statements of the NBA and the ABA. So I reached out to Roger Noll, who I had never actually met, but I reached out to him through either Rod Fort or John Solo. I'm not quite sure which one I actually reached out to first, but they put me in touch with Roger, and I asked Roger Noll in an email. I said, "Do you still have this data from 1971?" I mean, that was 50 years ago. And Roger writes back to me, and he says, "Had I known you wanted the data, I would have brought it to you in Cedar City. I was just in Utah a couple of weeks earlier." He said, "When I get back to Palo Alto in California, I will send it to you." Which he did. So that allowed me to come up with this paper idea. And so the data he shares with me is league revenue data from the NBA from 1967 to 1972, and then from the ABA from 67 to 71. That's the data that he's got. And then Rod Fort also reports a sample of salary data on his amazing website, which, by the way, I don't know if all of you know that, but Rod Fort's sports business page is now kept. It's kept at his same site, but it's also kept at the Library of Congress. So you might want to note that. So with the salary data in hand and the revenue data in hand, I was able to ask the question, how many players like Oscar Robertson were exploited in the NBA and the ABA? Or probably more precisely, what is the link between player value and salary in these two leagues? I want to start off just with a little bit of early history on the NBA. This has been noted in I think I've noted this table. This table's from another paper I wrote with Steve Engst in the book Sport Finance, which is actually a textbook. But I think I've put a similar table like this in other places. This is data from Rod Fort's website. This is income and payroll in the early history of the NBA. So if you look at what the NBA was receiving in income, it's between 1.5 to, not quite $2 million. If you adjust for inflation, that comes out to be about $20 million today, roughly. So the NBA is actually a very, very tiny league when it starts. And they do not get very many fans. It's a very small operation. Their payroll, which they also reported to Congress, is between $500,000 and $700,000, about $1 million less than the revenue. So if you do the math, they're paying their players roughly about 40% of their revenue in the early history when the NBA is very, very tiny. So when the NBA is less than 10 years old, and its revenue is not quite 20 million. They're paying about 40% of their revenue. I want to put that in contrast with another very early professional league right now, which is the WNBA. The WNBA, when we think about what the WNBA is being paid, we don't have very many. Right now, what we have is Forbes is reporting by team how much revenue NBA teams, NFL teams, Major League Soccer teams, Major League Baseball teams, National Hockey League teams, what they're all making. There is no similar effort for the WNBA. So we don't have it. So that's not there. But once upon a time, I worked at Forbes. I was writing for them for about a year and a half. And when I wrote for them, I made this, I did this analysis on my own. I noted that that the WNBA was earning, by my estimation in 2017, about $50 million. And I asked the question, well, what are they paying their players? We had a sample of player salary data, and from that we could figure out the average salary in the sample was $71,000. There was another report that said average salary $75,000, so that's pretty close to what was being reported. And so if you consider, average is 75,000, there's 157 players at that time playing in that year. They're paying, therefore, a little less than 12 million of their $50 million in revenue, which means the WNBA at that point is paying about 23% of their revenue to their players. So the league is, at that point, was much bigger than the NBA in its early history, but it was paying a much lower percentage to its players. That story ended up was read by a lot of people and eventually finds its way to the players. And this becomes something that they would note when they would talk about what they were paid. Kelsey Plum, who's a star for the Las Vegas Aces, made this comment: "I'm tired of people thinking that us players are asking for the same type of money as NBA players. We are asking for the same percentage of revenue shared within our CBA. NBA players receive around 50% of shared revenue, whereas we receive around 20%. So they learned that they were getting paid quite a bit less. It turns out I was really wrong. The WNBA revenue was not $50 million. At least it's probably likely it wasn't $50 million in 2017. We know that because Bloomberg, this is a story done by Jenna Hake. Bloomberg did a story just in 2023 where they were told by the league that WNBA revenue back in 2019, a couple of years after I did my analysis, was $100 million. So WNBA revenue was actually more than what I said it was when the players were getting paid an average $75,000. So WNBA players were actually only being paid closer to 10% of revenue when I was writing that. It wasn't 20%, it's closer to 10. And today, WNBA revenue is, again, Bloomberg is reporting this. They said that last year WNBA revenue was 200 million. And that has been confirmed a couple of times. And we know WNBA salaries, average salaries have gone up since then. There was a new collective bargaining agreement signed, but average salaries have only gone up a little bit. So the total is only now 17 million, which means today WNBA players are only getting 10% of league revenue. So the NBA early history, 40%, WNBA today, 10%. So this is just a few data points of leagues in their early history. What are they paying their players? So now we turn to the early history that we're focused on. This is the NBA in the late 1960s. The NBA at that point, now we're 10 years further along in our story from where we were before. The NBA in its 20th season, it set a record for attendance. It was averaging 6,000 fans a game. That was the first time it got to 6,000 fans per game. So it's not a very popular league. The Celtics and Bill Russell had just won their 8th consecutive NBA title. There's only 8 teams. So it was still 4 years before the NBA would manage to get every game of its NBA finals televised live. So the NBA really doesn't have a television contract of any note at this point. So this is not a successful league. It's not doing really all that well in its 20th year. Doesn't have very many fans, doesn't have much of a following. So obviously, why don't we start another one of these leagues? And that's exactly what happened. So in 1967, the ABA starts playing. And that story of the ABA is told in another book, again, another book I've actually read, by Terry Pluto, which tells the history of the ABA. And so that's a really interesting book to read, because the way Terry Pluto writes the book is it's actually just a series of interviews. He doesn't he's not telling the story in his words. He's telling the story in the words of the people who were involved in this enterprise. And so it's a very interesting story. When the ABA starts in 1967, average attendance is 2,800, which is, as far as I can tell, looking back at both NBA and WNBA data, neither of those leagues ever did that badly. The ABA really had no fans when it started. As one of its first stars noted, Connie Hawkins was the first major star in the ABA. Connie Hawkins would have been an NBA All-Star. He was banned from the NBA over a college gambling scandal, which it doesn't look like he was actually guilty of something, but he ended up being accused of something, so he got banned. He ended up in the ABA. And one of his quotes, again, this is from Terry. Actually, this is from a different article by Frank CLIX. There were a bunch of people at this point disguised as empty seats. The crowds were very small, as it says in that article. The crowds are so small you could count the house in the time it took to play the national anthem. There just weren't very many people showing up to this. So that's kind of where the ABA starts. And if we look at the data, this is, again, from Roger, and I don't think you can make this out. This is from the PDF that Roger Knoll sent me, so I don't know if you can make out the numbers exactly, but this is a screenshot of what he sent me. But this is league revenue is about, I think that's 600 million is what that's where it's located in 1971. At least I think that's what that is. I think that's in millions. It's actually quite small. We know that. So that's 600,000. It's not 600 million. Like it's 600,000. What am I saying? 600 million. That can't be 600 million. 600,000. So league revenue in 71 is 600,000, and 68 was 156,000. This is a really tiny operation. It's a very small operation. The NBA is quite a bit bigger in this time period. So that first line, we're looking at over $1 million in revenue. So it's quite a bit bigger. So given the average ABA revenue, that's why that didn't make sense. I was not reading the table right. So it's kind of hard to make out what that is. This is the average team revenue, not the league revenue. So these are average team revenue numbers. So the average team made 156,000 in 1968. That's not the league. And then this is the average team in the NBA makes $1 million in 1967. So these are the numbers. These are the average per team. The sample is most of the teams. Roger Knoll had most of the data. Most of the teams reported. These are the actual number of teams in the league. So if you just do simple multiplication, we get average ABA revenue in 1967 is 1.7 million. It's about 13% the size of the NBA at that point. And by the end of the sample period for the ABA that Roger had collected, they were about 23% the size of the NBA. So the ABA is a very small operation in the first 4 years of its operation. And the NBA, is growing. It's now much bigger than it was in 1956, which is exactly what you'd expect to see happen. The league starts getting bigger and bigger and bigger. Fans start to come to the league. Again, we are in the third decade of the NBA. That is, as we see in the WNBA right now, that's when revenues start to take off. That's when attendance starts to take off. This is a pretty consistent pattern, at least from what I have seen. You see this sort of pattern in the third and fourth decade is when leagues start taking off. All right, so the ABA though is not. This is the first 4 years, and the first, they got Connie Hawkins, but the first major star the ABA was able to attract that fans in sports would have known a lot about was Rick Berri. In 1967, Rick Berri, who was a star for the Warriors in the NBA, decides to leave the NBA, join the ABA. He signs a personal service contract with Pat Boone, that Pat Boone. Pat Boone is the singer. Pat Boone, the singer, owns the Oakland Oaks of the ABA. It gives Rick Berri a salary of $75,000 a year plus 15% ownership in the Oaks. Berri also receives 5% of the gate receipts if receipts are above 600,000. Again, league average is 150, so the Oaks aren't probably getting 600,000. But nevertheless, that was in the contract. And so the NBA manages to invoke the reserve clause and says that Rick Berri cannot join another league for 1 year. That's how the court interpreted that. For those who know early history of sports, a few years later, that's what ends up happening in baseball, is that reserve clause gets interpreted as it's a 1-year deal. And so for the NBA manages to keep Rick Berri out of the ABA for its first year. In '68, he joins the Oakland Oaks, and they win an ABA title. And he's paid $75,000. So the question is, was Rick Berri worth $75,000 to the Oaks? Is that what he was worth? All right, so that brings us to the question: how do we measure worker value in sports? To me, there's three basic approaches in how one does this. There's the classic Gerald Scully approach, which was put forward in his A article in 1974. There's the Tony Krautman approach in Economic Inquiry in 1999. And then Tony and I are co-authors on this paper in the Antitrust Bulletin, which looks at the value of Bob Gibson, which is a different approach that I'm going to be talking about in a moment. The Tony Krautman approach, the second one, the 99 one, doesn't work for our purposes because we don't actually have free agent salary data. The way Tony Krautman's data worked is you take the sample of free agents, you determine the free agent model, and then you apply the free agent model to the non-free agents. That's not really what's going on in the NBA and ABA at this point. There's just really aren't free agents. You could argue the players who switch leagues are free agents, but even with those players, there's not a big enough sample to really do the Tony Krautman approach. So we have the Gerald Scully approach or the second approach. Gerald Scully approach we actually also can't do, but before I get to why we couldn't even do this if we wanted to, I just want to say that we don't want to do it. So this is from Tony's and I article in 2019. There are some real problems with the Scully approach. If you go back and you look at what Scully did, and you look at the data that he has, and even if you update his approach with more sophisticated techniques than he had, because we do a better job of measuring player performance, and we can do a better job of creating a revenue model than he did back in 1974. But whether you look at Scully's actual numbers or you just redo the analysis based on the numbers we have, the Scully approach argues that baseball should have paid its players more than 100% of its revenue. That in order to pay them what they're worth, you pay them more than 100% of their revenue. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense that would be true. And in the article that he writes, Scully does some things so that it doesn't appear that that's the outcome. But when you realize what he was doing, you're like, okay, that doesn't work. It is still the case that your model says you should be paying your players more than the amount of revenue that actually was, which is probably wrong. So 2018, if you update the data, and if you go and look at the data later, then at that point, the Scully model argues that players in Major League Baseball should get paid only 29% of league revenue. And that's actually true whether you look at baseball, if you look at the National Football League, it is now the case that revenue and wins are not statistically linked. That was a point made in the book that I wrote with Ivan Kelly and Victor Matheson on the Super Bowl. In basketball, it's about 20%. In hockey, it's about 20%, according to the Scully approach. And the reason why that is because there are now fixed revenues. There are revenues that are not linked to wins at all. A lot of revenue is linked to the broadcasting deals. Those are not linked up to wins. And there's also a lot of shared revenue in these leagues, which are also not linked to wins. That was a point made with that was made with Mike Leeds and Peter von Allman back in 2015, is that these fixed revenues interfere with these calculations. So the Scully model doesn't give you a value of wins To me, that makes a whole lot of sense. The value of wins that you end up with is not really a reflection of the true economic value of a player, if that's what Scully was trying to get at. It really reflects how wins link up to revenue. And back in the late 60s, revenue was pretty much all about wins. The primary revenue source in baseball was the gate, and the gate was really linked up to wins. Today, they've made it so that in the top sports leagues, and this makes perfect sense they would do this, basing your revenue on wins is a really, really bad idea, because if everyone doesn't get a win, you don't want to have it be that if you don't win, you lose all your money. And so they've made it so that teams, especially in the NFL, teams can be financially successful even if they don't have any success on the field. So the Scully model in that sense doesn't work. It also doesn't work because it only values players according to their contribution to wins, which means bench players who are hired, who sit on the bench, and don't actually get in games, according to the Scully approach, they have zero value. That can't be right. Clearly, they're hired for a reason. Most of what players do in sports is not playing the games. Most of what they do is in practice. That practice is done for a reason. It has value. You need to have people in practice with the players who are playing. Somebody has to be there. And so you have to sort of figure out a way to value what is a bench player worth. The bench player is worth something. And Scully models says it's not. So hence we have a different approach. And I call this approach the Berri Goff approach. And I really should email Brian Goff and tell him I'm doing this, because it's been in a few articles now. I don't know Brian Goff that well. I know I've emailed him a few times. But this is how this sort of comes about. Back in March of 2014, I wrote an article for The Atlantic where I detailed what a NCAA men's basketball player was worth using essentially the approach that I'm going to be talking about. 10 days later, Brian Goff wrote an article for Forbes looking at the market value of NCAA athletes as well. I'm pretty damn sure Brian did not look at my article and write his article 10 days later. I just don't think that's what happened. I think Brian was doing this analysis on his own, and I was doing my analysis on his own. So we came up with a very similar approach. And so I think we both sort of get credit for doing this. So that's my thinking. All right. So it was these two articles that sort of, again, non-academic articles, and then a bunch of other studies sort of picked up on this. Most of these are co-authored by me, but a few other people have done this, have done the same approach. Looking at economic value using the approach that I'm about to describe here. So this is using the Brian Goff approach to explain value of Rick Berri. Is he worth $75,000? So the first step is you have to determine the amount of revenue that you think will go to the players. Roger Noll revealed that average revenue for each team was $294,000 in 68-69. With 11 teams, that league revenue would be $3.2 million. So that's in 68-69, the year that Rick Berri is playing. In 2021, in the article I wrote, basketball-related income in the NBA, 50% goes to the players. What's omitted from basketball-related income is they don't share 50% of the stadium suite revenue or the arena suite revenue. That is not 50-50, but the other revenue is 50-50. And if the ABA follows that route, then there's no suite revenue at this point. But if the ABA follows that same route, they'd be giving $1.6 million to their players. So that means that we can use that to figure out the average wage. There's 147 players who play at least a minute in the ABA in 68-69. If those players are splitting up the $1.6 million, then each player is paid an average salary of $11,000. So that's the average. Step three is you figure out the minimum salary. That's what you're going to be paying the bench players. So we want to figure out what bench players, and the argument I make in these articles is that they should be paid what the NBA, all these leagues have a minimum wage, and that seems to be what they are agreeing to pay their bench players. We do know the NBA's minimum from a New York Times article. It actually reported the NBA had a minimum salary of $13,000, $13,500 in 68-69. So the NBA minimum wage would have been higher than what the ABA could have paid average if they gave 50% of their revenue to their players. And so that NBA minimum wage was 28% of the league average. If the ABA follows that same practice, the minimum wage would be $3,000. Step 4, you got to figure out the dollar value of a win. There are 147 players guaranteed $3,000. This means the league will be paying $453,000 to its players in minimum wages. That leaves $1.1 million left over for performance. If the primary objective is to create wins with performance, then the players are going to be splitting up the wins. Are going to be splitting that up by how many wins they produce. So the value of each additional win produced by the players was $2,514. Now, the next thing we have to figure out is how many wins do they produce. So I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes explaining that. I've written a lot of stuff on this over the years. I've said this paragraph right here, I have put in a number of articles I've written for the Popular Press. I think might be in my textbook. It's probably in other articles I've written. Basketball is a fairly simple game. Teams win because they acquire possession of the ball without the other team scoring. So they grab defensive rebounds, they create turnovers. They keep possession of the ball, they avoid turnovers, grab offensive rebounds, and they turn possessions into points, which means they shoot efficiently from the feet on the line. So that's the game. The game is rebounds, turnovers, shooting efficiency. That's the game of basketball. Those are the things that drive wins. Basketball is a very, very easy game to statistically analyze. It's not very complicated at all. The players are remarkably consistent from year to year. There are not very significant player interaction effects. If you look at the correlation and year-to-year performance in the NBA, it is far beyond what you see in any other sport I've looked at. NBA players are the top players are consistently the best players. The players who are not very productive are consistently not very productive. I've written articles explaining why that would be the case. So if you're a stat person, basketball is easy to understand. Baseball is also not terribly hard to understand from the hitter's perspective. It gets harder when you look at the pitchers. But then when you look at other sports such as hockey or soccer or American football, that becomes kind of a nightmare. Those sports are really quite a bit harder to analyze statistically. Fortunately, we're not doing that. We're looking at basketball. Basketball is fairly easy. And basketball is made easier because of the box score. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the box score here. In the mid-1960s, the NBA is only collecting the following stats: field goals made, field goals attempted, free throws made, free throws attempted, total rebounds, assists, personal fouls, and then they take their shots and figure out points. And that's it. That's all they had. The NBA is not collecting data on offensive rebounds, defensive rebounds, turnovers, steals, or block shots, which means the key in analyzing how many wins the player produces, the way I do it, is you have to measure offensive and defensive possessions. And the data at this point in time in the NBA doesn't allow you to do that. Fortunately, the ABA is different. We're looking at Rick Berri here, so he's in the ABA. ABA is different because of a guy named Lee Meade. The ABA creates the traditional box score. And the person responsible for that, again, is Lee Meade. Lee Meade, and this is in the Terry Pluto book, he says, when the ABA began, I was amazed how little preparation went into it. One day I talked to some people I knew in the ABA office and asked them, what were they going to do about the stats? They said they hadn't thought about it. I said the league was getting ready to start in a couple of weeks and somebody should do something. And so Meade decided to do something. He said, this is a great opportunity to start doing something in basketball that Meade had always wanted to see happen. He always wanted to see a league track offensive and defensive rebounds, track turnovers, track block shots, track steals. And so he creates a worksheet for the ABA teams, and he has them start tracking this data, which means the ABA has complete box score data from its inception. And we can go through and measure the wins produced of every ABA player that ever played because that data existed. Lee Meade would point out that the very first season, that box score data wasn't perfect. The teams didn't quite keep it as well as Lee Meade wanted it. But nevertheless, it was kept for the entire history of the league as well as they could. If you look at the second season, which season we're interested in, that's the one Rick Berri starts playing. This is the Oakland Oaks in 1968-69, and this was in the article I wrote about Oscar Robertson. So the Oakland Oaks win the ABA title. They won 60 games that year, I believe out of 84. So they won 60 games. They won the title. Rick Berri is their top player on a per minute basis. Per 48 minutes, he produced .259 wins, which is the top of the team. Jim Aikens was pretty close to that. He's not the top in overall productivity because Berri wasn't there the whole season. He only played 35 games, but he was the top in per minute. But he's not alone. There's other players on this team. Some of these players you might have heard of if you know anything about NBA history. Larry Brown was on that team. Very good player. Larry Brown went on to be, I don't know that he is. I think he's a Hall of Fame coach. He should be. Larry Brown had a very successful coaching career in college and the NBA. Doug Moe is another very successful coach. He was also on this team and also an above average player. Average is .1, so these are all above average players. Almost every player on the Oaks was above average except for 3 of them, which is why they were very successful. So we know how many wins Rick Berri produced. Now that we know the wins, we can now put together what is the value of Rick Berri. We start with the minimum wage. He's paid $3,000 minimum. Everyone gets that. The value of a win is $2,500, as we said before. He produced 7 wins, so he's worth $20,000, or $21,000 basically. He got paid $75,000, so he is dramatically overpaid. So Berri's paid $75,000 by the Oaks. His productivity is worth $21,000. So that assumes that league revenue is shared at 50%. If Berri plays 88 games, it was 88 games, not 84, plays 88 games, and the ABA gave 71% of its revenue to the players, then Berri would have been worth $75,000. So if the ABA would have split 70%, and that's actually what is done in Europe, then Berri would have been paid what he's worth. At least that player would have been. If we look at the other players in the league, this is where Rick Berri ranks in terms of MRP. The top player was Jimmy Jones, produced 22 wins, was worth almost $60,000. Roger Brown's another very good player, was worth $41,000. Connie Hawkins with Minnesota Pipers was worth $27,000. Again, average salary is $11,000 if they were splitting revenue at 50%. So the average wage in the NBA at that point was $35,000. We know that from the salary sample we get from Rod Ford. Only 4 ABA players had an estimated MRP greater than this average. For the ABA to have an average salary of $35,000, it would have to pay more than 150% of its league revenue to its players. So if the ABA was actually going to compete with the NBA in recruiting players and do it with salaries, they would have to pay more money to their players than the actual revenue would exist. So they are clearly, I think it's pretty clear, they are dramatically overpaying their players in order to attract talent. Now, we can do the same thing for the NBA at the same time. So the NBA, step 1, we know what average team revenue is. If they split 50%, NBA players get $8 million. Minimum wage is $13,500. We don't need to calculate that because they told us what it was. Given 168 players, the value of a win would be $9,000, just doing the same calculation from before. Now, we have a problem. We don't have all the data. We don't have we don't have offensive rebounds, defensive rebounds. So what I did is you run a really simple regression with the data that we have. So we take, and I did this. This regression is for players in the NBA. The sample goes from 73, 74 to 76, 77. There's 985 players. You regress productivity per 48 minutes on the stats that we had before 73, before the NBA started doing the box score. And we use that to estimate each player's productivity, not adjusted for position. And then we use that we adjust for position and figure out their wins produced. It turns out when you do that, If you have the complete box score data, the difference between wins and the summation of wins produced for a team is usually about 2 to 3 wins. You're very, very close to the actual number. If you don't have all the data, your average error is about 5 or 6. It's about double that. So you're missing some. You're not quite as accurate. This is what the Boston Celtics would look like in 68-69. They won the NBA title that year. They won 48 games for this team. The model says that they should have won 50 games. Again, there's other teams that are off by like 10 wins. So it's not quite this close for everybody. But Bill Russell would be worth 250, was worth 17 wins, and John Havlicek's worth 10 wins. If we go through and look at what Bill Russell was worth, Bill Russell was worth minimum is 13,000. Win value of a win is 9,600. He produced 17 wins. He's worth 179,000 is what he's worth. And so Wilt Chamberlain is worth over $100,000, just like Oscar Robertson was. These are the MRPs given in 68-69. So you can see that Wilt Chamberlain is the most productive player and worth the most. He's worth close to 300,000. There's 3 other players in the $200,000 club, and these are all these players are worth more than 100,000. Now, turns out these players are exploited. Joan Robinson gave us the definition of exploitation. The original citation is in 1969. It's in the 1930s. Joan Robinson notes that a player is exploited or worker is exploited if their wage is less than their MRP. If we go back and we look at the data, we can see, given the Roger Knoll data, average MRP in the data set goes from 41,000 to 54,000 as the league is increasing in size. Average salary, though, is consistently less than that. NBA is only paying about 40% of its revenue to its players. So if you think they should be paid 50%, then you would argue that they are all being underpaid. Then in 1970-71, it appears the exploitation begins to stop. Revenue goes up, but salaries go up pretty dramatically. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is paid close to $400,000 in this time period. And so we start to see a big uptick in average pay. The average salary goes to close to $100,000. Just a couple of years earlier, there was just a few players in the $100,000 club. Now the average is $100,000 in 72-73. In 73-74, average NBA salary is again $100,000. The top is Kareem. And so we start to see players on average are paid $23 million. They're paid actually about 50% of the league revenue. So the story is that and this is sort of the punchline of the paper. Given what we know about revenue and attendance in the ABA, players in that league were overpaid. They had to overpay their players to get them into the league. And so they were clearly losing money. This was not a very successful league financially when it starts. There's no fans, and they have to pay their players a tremendous amount of money just to get them to show up. The NBA continues to exploit its players. If you think they should be paying 50%, they're not doing that in the late 1960s. And primarily because I don't think there is a few players who are jumping ship from the NBA to the ABA like Rick Berri, but a lot of players are not. The ABA is not yet a serious threat. I don't think they were a serious threat when they are doing that hearing in 1971. I think the players like Oscar Robertson saw that they could become a serious threat, and having them out there was helpful. But they were not the threat that they would become after that. The ABA started to do a very concerted effort in the early 1970s to recruit underclassmen out of college. Players like Julius Erving, Dr. J, were recruited as undergrads. They also recruited a player like Moses Malone, who effectively came out of high school. Spencer Haywood came very early on as well. And so the ABA starts to become a lot more talented. You can see that in the data when the ABA is playing the NBA in exhibitions. Early on, the NBA dominates those exhibitions. They win almost all of them. And then as we go forward, the ABA starts to become equal to the NBA and in some cases actually surpass the NBA in talent, because the ABA was getting the players before they were graduating. The NBA was still insisting you had to play 4 years of college to join the NBA, and the ABA didn't have that. So the ABA is getting better talent. And so eventually the NBA is threatened by the ABA, and the NBA dramatically increases their salaries. And by then they start to be paid what they're worth. But that's after the hearing, not before the hearing. Is what was we see that happening. So it's a really kind of I think it's a fun little story. And again, it's made possible by there we go. So it's made possible by the fact that we have this data from Roger Knoll, which was kind of fun to see that was out there, and he delightfully shared it with me and allowed me to look at that. And it's just a part of professional basketball history that doesn't get explored a whole lot. And it is, I think, a fairly interesting little story. And I do find that the history of the ABA to be quite fascinating because they did do a lot of innovations that the NBA later adopts. The three-point shot is obviously the other one that people focus on, although that did not come initially from the ABA. That was actually from another league in the early 60s that lasted for about a year. And then the ABA adopted it after that. So, all right. So that's my story this morning or afternoon, depending upon where you are.
Thanks very much, Dave. Lots of time for questions and comments, if anyone has any. Okay, Georgi, first up.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation today. This is indeed, I would agree, a very underexplored period in professional basketball history in North America. I was just wondering, so it's all like the model appears to work and produce sensible results for the years that there were no salary caps in the leagues, but applying it to modern data to figure out are players getting what they're worth? Do you think it will not work because of the salary cap? Because essentially now you have a maximization restriction on how the teams can assemble their rosters. And well, some players may produce a lot more wins. They will ultimately not be getting paid what they're worth because of the arbitrary cap on the salary. That's my first question. And then another one is really quickly. Yeah, let's start with the first one, please. Sorry.
Well, if you look at data today and whether they're overpaid or underpaid, it is pretty clear LeBron James, Steph Curry are dramatically underpaid. I mean, at the salary cap, because the NBA they have more restrictions on salaries than I think any other league. They have a restriction on payroll for the team. They have restrictions on payroll for the league. The league can only pay a certain percentage. So if the NBA players are paid beyond the league average, what the contract says, they have to give money back. So there's a restriction on the league. There's a restriction on the rookies. There's a restriction on the veterans. The restrictions at every level of experience, and all of that's done in the name of competitive balance, which the NBA does not actually have, and it's never had, it never will have, and so it's all a scam. And as a result of that, LeBron James, Steph Curry produced far more revenue than they were ever paid. Because the NBA's made it so that they have a maximum salary restriction. And so they say, well, we're going to pay you at maximum, 40 or 50 million. And you run the numbers, you're like, they're worth like 80 million. And so you're way off. But it is the case that then when you go to the players, at the other end of the extreme, they're worth quite a bit less. Also, I should point out, when the NBA says it's 50% of basketball related, this is something that always puzzled me when I would do analysis. I would go through and I'd look at, you look at average salary in the league and you look at revenues, how many players there were. And you're like, well, I'm not getting 50%. They're not paying 50%. Where's the 50% coming from? If you go to the website, the salary cap, FAQ, Larry Kuhn's website, you can find he has it set up. You have to go through it point by point. It's like it is reading a legal document, so it's kind of hard to find it. He notes the stadium suite revenue, which is now pretty big. They arbitrarily do this. They say, hey, 25% of the players are only going to get 25% of that. So what they do is they say 50% of suite revenue automatically goes to the NBA, and then we're going to split the other 50% 50-50. And you're like, well, how did you decide that you get 50% off the top? We just decided. So when you do it, the NBA players are only actually getting 40% of league revenue today, which is roughly what they were getting in the late 60s and what they were getting back in 1950s. 40% seems to be what they want to pay them. And the NBA players go along with that. But it does, if you argue they should get paid 50%, this is the issue with the method that that I developed, that I think I developed with Brian Goff, is that you do have to decide as a researcher what you think the split should be. I noted this in the paper on Bob Gibson. I think what all this analysis tells me is I think economists with Gerald Scully had this idea. There is some objective measure of a worker's value that you could figure out that this is what they're worth. And it actually, if you think about history of economic thought, it kind of harkens back to what you see in Adam Smith when he talks about, there's natural laws that say what people should get. And there's the Jeremy Bentham response to that is nonsense on stilts, which I always like that quote, nonsense on stilts. I think the answer is Jeremy Bentham's right. There's no natural law. You simply make an argument in what you're doing and saying, if you think they should be paid 50%, are they there or not? And you can come back and say, well, maybe they shouldn't get 50%. Maybe they should only get 40%. Or what they do in Europe, maybe they should get 70%. We don't know that number. You have to decide that as a researcher.
Yeah, if I may, thank you very much. If I may, the other one is very simple. Like, do you think that the teams are double oriented in terms of their strategies? Like, their teams are not only win maximizing, but they can be win minimizing? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, ABA had the draft, and knowing that you couldn't really attract much talent, you weren't salary competitive with the NBA. You had to, basically position pretty well in the draft to get any form of competitive advantage. So do you think that players could have been evaluated, or have you looked at players being evaluated and how many losses, for instance, they produce? Or at a certain part of the season, if the teams decide to tank, was there evidence of tanking in the ABA?
Well, I'm going to argue, if you read the history of the ABA, I find it hard to believe they were thinking that many. They're not playing chess. This is a league playing checkers. They are not thinking that hard about stuff. So I don't think these are, Pat Boone is owning this team. The dude's a singer. He's not like sitting there going, I wonder what my strategy should be. These people barely know what they're doing. Most of the ABA is stuff they make up as they go along. The original slam dunk contest, which the NBA used, that came about because they had a meeting, and they talk about that in the book. They have a meeting, and there's just some guy sitting in the office going, what do you think we should do to attract fans? They're like, well, people like dunking. Why don't we do like a dunk thing? You're like, okay, we'll do that. We'll do a dunk thing. And they just so the idea that they're thinking like several steps ahead, hey, if I tank these games, I'll get this. I don't think anyone's doing that. They are doing the best they can with what they got. They're not making any money. So I don't think that is all what's going on with this league. They are not thinking that hard about. These are not big thinkers. They are barely surviving as a league. They are really, all they're hoping to do, the ABA strategy from the start is, if we can just hang on and not go out of business, the NBA will give us a franchise, and then we'll have a team in the NBA, and then we will make money. But the ABA is like, they knew there is no way we're replacing the NBA. That's not going to happen. We're never going to be big enough to do that. And so they were just trying to force a merger. And when that hearing went against them in 71 and their merger got stopped, they were panicked. They were, what are we going to do here? And when you get to 1976 and the merger finally happens, and it happens because the NBA and the ABA sit down with the NBA players and they say, okay, we want this merger to happen. What do we have to give you to make it happen? And the players said, we want absolute free agency. You give us free agency. You let us negotiate with teams. We'll let you have your merger. And that's the deal they made. And when it happened, there were teams that died right before the merger. They almost made it and they went out of business. They don't exist anymore. And there's a few teams, that made it, and they brought them in, 4 of them. And then there were other teams, they just said, you're not financially viable. You're not going to make it. And so they let them go. But there were 4 teams that survived, and that was the end of it. But that last year, the ABA was in very deep financial trouble. I don't know they would have come back for another season had that merger not happened. And the NBA got free agency out of it for a little while. And then in '83, David Stern did the strategy that they have done ever since, that they also originated in '71, where he said, we are all losing money. We cannot afford to pay you players this amount of money and stay in business. We are on the brink of bankruptcy. And so that's when the first payroll cap comes into play. And then when that worked, the NBA's done that strategy ever since. They always say that we are on the brink of bankruptcy. The NBA's never made any money. So apparently the ABA was wrong. You can't make money at basketball. You should never have joined this league because there's no money in it. So that's the story, I think.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave. Next question is Babak.
Hi, thanks, James. Hi, thanks for the really interesting talk. I had a question about, I have 2 questions, which is related to what you were talking about just now. First, I guess the way I always viewed it is, I understand what you mean in terms of 50% or 40%, like what the actual percentage of the revenue that is being shared. But that, to me, that is the negotiation about like players versus owners. But the salary cap to me seems a little more like how that gets distributed amongst the players, because if you have because at the end of the day, the NBA will have to then top up if the players' salaries don't match the percentage they're supposed to get. So to me, it seems like LeBron agreeing not to get paid his value, it's at least partially so that, the lowest player can get more than his value. And I always perceive it as somehow as the top players willing to share more of the revenue with the lower players because they understand that the lower players are also important for the league sort of succeeding. So that's my first question. To what extent do you think that may be part of the story? Or is it really like by negotiating on LeBron's top salary, the league is trying to keep this player? But I kind of don't see that as being the case if the league is agreeing to a certain fixed percentage of revenues. And so then it's more about distribution. And the other question I have is like, to what extent do you think players should sort of be credited for the fact that the owners now, the value of that Mark Cuban like bought the Mavericks for what, 300 million or something not that long ago, and then recently sold them for 2.5 billion, and that's really sort of where the money is happening in the NBA ownership. It's not about revenues, it's about future and I guess the value of the business overall. So those are my 2 questions. Thank you very much for a really interesting presentation.
All right. Okay, let me deal with both of those. So the once upon a time in the NBA, and Todd Jewell and I did a paper on this, I don't know, 20 years ago, where the NBA did this really weird thing in the 90s. They decided to do this. They briefly decided to create a system where everyone could be a free agent, but there would still be this payroll cap in place. And it allowed certain teams, and the 2 teams that did this were the Houston Rockets and I believe the Chicago Bulls. What they did is they said, these 2 teams said, we're going to pay our 3 top players almost everything we got, and everyone else gets minimum wage. And so when you look at the salary distribution of those teams, it looks really weird. You have a player at the top getting 30 million, and then you have a roster of, at that time, minimum wage is 250,000. So it's every other player, 250,000, 250,000. That's the roster. And so Todd Jewell and I was it Todd Jewell or Rob? Someone of us. What we wrote, I don't remember these papers, but we wrote a paper and we asked the question: if you create a situation where the top player gets everything and everyone else gets minimum, does that affect the productivity of the players? Do they sit there when they're playing with each other going, screw you, why am I throwing the ball to you? You get $30 million. I'm never throwing the ball to you at all. And I think we found out that they didn't do that. But I think if it was a team of economists, they would have done that. But they didn't do that. So I think it's true. LeBron James ended up, he might agree that this is an okay thing to do, but at one point the NBA did actually create a situation where they could do that, where there was no maximum salary and you could actually just pay your top player as much as you want. And they did try that, and the teams were successful. The other question about the valuation of the teams, this is something that is very true about men's sports, not yet true in women's sports, but it's true in men's sports. The valuation of these teams seems to not entirely reflect the revenues. And the reason why that is, and you see this, especially you see this in Major League Soccer, where Major League Soccer teams are selling for $300 million when there's really there's no data that says that they're worth that. What happens is you have a small collection of very wealthy, you have a large collection of very wealthy men, billionaires. And the way in which you can become famous as a billionaire is to buy a sports team. It's very hard to be famous otherwise. For the most part, billionaires are largely anonymous. But you buy a sports team, you become famous. But there's only so many sports teams and among the men's sports. And so they bid up the price of these things well beyond what you'd expect. And because they're worth billions, they don't give a damn. I mean, I gave an interview to golf.com a few weeks ago. It was a very fun interview where they talked to me for 2 hours, and then the actual article was just me. They just quoted me. There was no actual writing. I effectively wrote the article on the phone, and so it was just me writing this. And in the article, I said, they asked me, why are the Saudis, why are Saudi investors investing in PGA golf? And they were doing the same thing economists typically do. Well, is there a revenue reason why they're doing this? And I said, it occurred to me as I was talking to him, I said, I think we should think about this and say, billionaires already have money. If they wanted money, they have money. They have lots of money. They go to the beach and just invest their money. They have money. They don't want money. They want people to pay attention to them. They buy these things as consumption goods. And I said, in the case of the Saudis, I'm sure they all wanted to be involved in golf. They're just not good enough. So they bought the golfers. And so now I'm involved in golf. And it's the same reason why people buy basketball teams. I'm not good enough to play NBA basketball, but I can buy the basketball players, and therefore I'm involved. So I think that's what reflects it. Do the players deserve some share? I would imagine they probably do. That's what you're buying. And so, yeah, they probably should get some kind of split on these massive deals. But they're not negotiated. They're not negotiating those things. So, all right.
Thanks, Dave. Next question is Ian.
Hi, David. I wondered, is there any possibility of getting injury data from this sort of time period? So there's been a couple of papers now, I'm responsible for one of them, that uses injuries as an identifying event to try to work out how much players are worth. In my case, not basketball, but NFL. So yeah, I was wondering if is it possible to go back in time and dig out information on these players and whether they picked up injuries and whether the franchises that were unlucky to be hit with a large amount of injuries, you could actually see that in their revenues or not?
Yeah, you're not going to get that. You barely got the revenue data. There's no data. We barely have any data. What was interesting about this paper is like we have very little data here. We can tell a story, but I don't think there's any injury data. We don't have, we barely have any data. And the thing is, you're not going to get, there is in the Roger Knoll data. And I didn't say this in the presentation, but he sent me a big PDF document of everything he had. And the way he does it, the revenue data, he does have team by team revenue data. It's there. Unfortunately, the teams aren't identified. What it says in the data, it says ABA team 1, ABA team 2, ABA team 3, ABA team 4. And you're like, which are those teams? I don't even know that Roger knows which because he didn't write it down. Okay. It was presented to Congress, and I don't think they wanted to identify the teams. So it's just listed as the teams are given a code, and there's no other identifying information there. It's just this is the revenue data. So you're like, well, which team is team 3? I don't know. Could be any of the teams. And since you don't know which revenue data goes with which team, you couldn't do the Scully model that way or anything else. We just don't have that kind of data. I was thrilled that we just had the revenue data for the league, which allowed me to do what I was doing, which was neat. I was very thrilled that Roger had collected that because I didn't know that even existed. But there is no, we don't have anything beyond that. There's no way to do any of the stuff that we do now, that people try to do now in basketball. There's no play-by-play data. None of that exists. They barely kept the box score. And Lee Mead makes that point. He said that first year, he said he'd get box scores back from teams and it would say stuff. Well, I think there was like 43 rebounds, I think, maybe. I don't know. We had some confusion. It's somewhere in that range. You're like, what does that mean? It's like, I don't know. We're not doing, there's only 4 fans here. Nobody's paying attention. I don't know what's going on. So yeah. It's just really sketchy data.
Okay. Yeah. Now I was wondering, so yeah, a little disconcerting that you said that the Scully approach can take you to some quite bizarre places, because my paper essentially follows that approach, but uses injuries as well to try to get a handle on these identifying
the Scully. Yeah, that's the thing we discovered. I mean, when I first started doing sports econ research back in the 90s, I just had a lot of trouble applying it to basketball and getting the Scully model to say something that looked reasonable. And it took us a long time to figure out what the hell's going on in this league. Why are all the values? At that time, all the values were telling me NBA players are dramatically overpaid. They're only worth like 25% of revenue, according to Scully. And then I started looking at baseball and football and hockey, and I started seeing the same pattern. And I went back and did the original. I just redid the Scully analysis. And it's all of that stuff is you're capturing the value of a win in the marketplace. And that depends on the nature of the marketplace. And so it's not really some kind of, I think Scully was telling us, this is some kind of objective value of what they're worth. And it's like, no, it's an estimate based on what the market value of a win is. And that varies tremendously on how they structure the league. And so I don't know what the hell that means. So it seems to me an easier approach, and also an approach that works even when you don't have, a lot of data, is to go in and say, well, let's just say they get 50%. Where does that take us? And then you can do a table, and I've done this. We did this in the Bob Gibson thing. If you say 30%, 40%, 50%, you do different percentages, you get different estimates, and you can say, okay, at what level would it have to be for them to be paid what they're worth? And you can ask, and then it's up to the reader side. Does that look reasonable to you? Should they be paid 20%? Should they be paid 80%? But the idea that there's some objective true value, I don't think that's true. I don't think anyone has an objective true value. It's all based on what your bargaining power is. So.
Sure. Okay. In the interest of self-promotion, I'm putting my paper in the chat so you can have a look at it if you're interested. So it's there. And for everyone else who's interested.
Thanks. Ian. And Bernt's got a question.
Hi, Dave. Thanks a lot for a very entertaining presentation. I have a probably stupid question. Do you suggest creation of a WABA league to bring women's salaries at an equal level?
There would be a lot of reason to do something like that. This is the WNBA has restricted the number of teams, much like the NBA did. The NBA did the same thing. They had 8 teams. They had no competition. WNBA is at 12 teams. They're adding 2 more slowly, but they're not adding teams as fast as their talent base is. So Caitlin Clark is a major star right now. And I gave a couple of interviews about Caitlin Clark this week, and people are saying, well, is she going to transform the WNBA? And I said, the WNBA is 12 all-star teams. Caitlin Clark's going to find that every night she's playing an all-star. And that's going to be a little bit different than playing in college, because the WNBA is totally restricted number of teams. And what happened when the ABA showed up is they didn't just change the salaries of the NBA players. It changed the number of teams. They went from 8 teams to 17 teams. They went into every market they could think of going to. And there would be a lot of value in doing that. And there's a lot of players out there that could fill up a WABA. It would not make any money. You'd have to do it knowing you're not making any money on this. You're going to be starting at 0. So you're going to have no fans, just like the ABA was. So you'll have no fans, you'll make no money, but you'd be doing God's work by forcing the WNBA to expand and pay their players more money. So if there were some billionaires out there who wanted to throw a few $1 million away, start a WABA and force the WNBA to make different decisions. But I don't see anyone proposing they're going to do that. But you're right. I think it would work. It would definitely work if you had somebody who wanted to throw away some money.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Bernt. Any more questions and comments?
Where is chat in Teams? I don't see a chat. Where's the chat thing?
Sometimes you just can't see it. It's one of
Oh,
the mysteries of Teams.
no.
Some
So
people can see it. Some people
Ian
can't.
shared the paper, but Ian, I don't even know where chat is. I can't even find the paper. So I don't see a chat feature. So
maybe send him an email, Ian. Might be the best.
Yeah.
I'll try. Yeah, thank you.
Yogi had his hand up.
All good. Yes, please. Sorry.
Okay, no worries.
Okay, all right, that's not a problem. Okay, yeah, I can't see that in Teams. I'm like, where is that? It is what it is.
Work for some people doesn't work for others. Okay,
Yeah.
well, with no more questions, then it's time to say thank you very much, Dave. That was a really, really interesting talk. I've seen one piece of Teams applause. I'm going to give you some Teams applause as well.
Thank you very much. It was fun. I love doing these things. These are fun.
Yep. And we take a break now for Easter. And we next will meet sometime in April. Let me find the details. We will meet April 12th, Galila Nasser from University of Bielefeld, effect of geographical proximity on youth talent development, application on German football. So we will have a great Easter. I wish you all a great Easter and see you in April. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right. Thanks for having me.
Cheers, Dave.